In this video, we're going to talk about the 1974 film, The Man with a Golden Gun. After Sean Connery decided to leave the global film franchise phenomenon that he helped create, Eon tried to replace him with George Lazenby in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And despite being an excellent film, the box office was lukewarm. So Sean Connery returned for one last film in Diamonds Are Forever, but vowed he would never again play 007. And so movie fans, movie critics, and Hollywood insiders began to wonder if the James Bond franchise could actually survive without Sean Connery. Well, the 1973 film Live and Let Die starring Roger Moore was a huge box office hit, giving Eon hope that there might be a 007 after Connery. And the very next year, they followed it up with The Man with the Golden Gun. Roger Moore returned just as dapper and sophisticated as he was in the previous film, and it had a great villain in Scaramanga, who was a worthy antagonist to our James Bond. It had a great villain henchman in Knick Knack, and it had a beautiful exotic locale of Thailand. And it also had the beautiful Maud Adams as Scaramanga's girlfriend. And it had some incredible practical stunts, even if one of them was ruined by an inappropriate sound effect. On the other hand, it had a very weak Bond girl in Mary Goodnight, played by Brick Eklund. And it has one of the weaker stories of the James Bond franchise. And this film had a very low budget, which certainly shows on screen. And in case you were thinking, I can really use a little more Sheriff J.W. Pepper, well, this movie's got you covered, because this movie has Sheriff Pepper galore. So Roger Moore made a worthy debut as a very different James Bond than Sean Connery's iconic depiction of the character. And the producers were very happy with the success of the last film, and they were confident in this new direction with Roger Moore. And it looked like Roger Moore was here to stay. So the producers decided to repeat the same formula as the last film and maybe take it a little further. They rehired Guy Hamilton, who had directed the uber-classic Goldfinger in 1964, and he returned to direct Diamonds Are Forever and then directed the last film, Live and Let Die. And Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and Man with a Golden Gun sort of constitute an odd James Bond trilogy of films and a somewhat nadir of the franchise. However, 1974 was not the first time The Man with the Golden Gun entered pre-production. About 7 years before the production of this movie, in 1967, after You Only Live Twice, when Sean Connery had just announced his retirement from the role, The Man with the Golden Gun starring Roger Moore was originally going to be the next sixth James Bond film. And Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman and Roger Moore even went to Cambodia to film some test footage. Then, of course, we know that the Cambodian Revolution broke out with the Khmer Rouge and the civil war that would lead to the Cambodian killing fields. So that film was canceled. And eventually Broccoli and Saltzman decided to go in a completely different direction with George Lazenby in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Well, years later in 1974, they get to return to their original plan that was started in 1967. The Man with the Golden Gun was the 13th James Bond novel by Ian Fleming, published in 1964. And it was actually the last novel that he wrote and was published posthumously by his family. And there was an interesting controversy at the time in the Bond literary world whether Ian Fleming actually died before finishing the book, and for some time it was believed that maybe Cubby Broccoli or Harry Saltzman or the book publishers may have secretly hired a ghostwriter to finish the book after his death. However, we believe now, based on what some friends say, that Ian Fleming may have actually indeed finished the book by himself. Because some correspondence shows that after writing the book, Ian Fleming wrote to his friends that he didn't like the book and felt that he may have lost his touch and was seriously thinking about retiring from writing. And then, of course, he soon passed away from a heart attack. And now modern Ian Fleming scholars generally believe that the words on The Man with the Golden Gun novel were fully written by Ian Fleming. This film also marks the exit of one half of Eon Productions, Harry Saltzman. Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli were there from the beginning, and they were partners. They basically created the persona of James Bond on screen. By this time, their relationship was dissolving fast and would completely dissolve by the end of this film. And by the time they made The Spy Who Loved Me, which was delayed for over 3 years, Harry Saltzman was completely out, and that film was solely made by Cubby Broccoli. So to lay the foundations of the trouble, these were two ruthless businessmen who joined forces in 1961 to form a company called Danjaq, which would buy the rights to the James Bond franchise. Danjaq was named after their wives at the time, Dana and Jacqueline. So the tensions began because the two had very different attitudes toward the James Bond franchise. Cubby Broccoli felt that the James Bond franchise was gold and dedicated everything to it. His sole focus was on Eon Productions. While on the other hand, Harry Saltzman had many ventures and felt that Eon Productions was a small part of his overall empire. So Cubby Broccoli felt that Harry Saltzman was not as invested as he was and felt that he was doing most of the heavy lifting in making the James Bond movies, while they equally shared the profits. And that was at the core of the tension. Just to give you an idea how uninvolved Harry Saltzman was, the crew talk about the elephant stampede incident. So Cubby Broccoli was fully involved in this movie from the beginning, and he was there when Mankiewicz wrote the first draft of the screenplay. He and Guy Hamilton went all across the world looking for a good place to shoot the movie. Well, Harry Saltzman's contribution to the movie, he told Tom Mankiewicz that the final confrontation between James Bond and Scaramanga should involve an elephant stampede. Harry Saltzman thought it would be really cool if Bond and Scaramanga faced each other while riding wild elephants. Well, that confused everybody since it wasn't in the script, and it would have been a major change to the budget to hire 200 elephants. Well, and then Harry Saltzman disappeared, presumably to deal with his other non-James Bond business ventures, so everyone on the crew forgot about Saltzman's elephant idea. Then one day the crew received a huge shipment of over 1,000 elephant shoes. Apparently, Harry Saltzman learned that to have elephants on a movie, they had to wear specialized elephant shoes. And so Harry Saltzman hired an elephant shoemaker and had 1,000 elephant shoes made. And of course, there was no elephant stampede, so there was no elephants, and so there was no use of these elephant shoes. But it gives you an idea how out of touch Harry Saltzman was in regard to the production of the James Bond movies. So Harry Saltzman had a lot of business ventures outside of the James Bond films, and in 1969, one of the business ventures he made was in Technicolor Motion Picture Corporation. And this ended up being one of those crazy business ventures involving ousting of people on the board and crazy business stuff like that. But to make a complicated story as simple as possible, Harry Saltzman got a $40 million loan from Union Bank of Switzerland, and he got control of Technicolor Motion Pictures. And he bought it for $30 a share. But after a few years, Technicolor Motion Pictures was only worth $8 a share. And so Harry Saltzman could not pay the Swiss bank back and even missed a few interest payments. So to pay back the Swiss bank, he asked Cubby Broccoli to dissolve their company Danjaq so he could pay back the Swiss bank. And Cubby Broccoli originally agreed, but he later reneged. And Cubby Broccoli said that it was because he would have to pay too much in taxes, but it was likely because he wanted to purchase Harry Saltzman's shares directly and take sole ownership of Danjaq, and hence sole ownership of the entire James Bond franchise. So Harry Saltzman was so upset with Broccoli that he decided to stick it to Cubby Broccoli and sold his shares not to Cubby Broccoli, but to United Artists. So Cubby Broccoli owned half of the James Bond property, and United Artists owned the other half. And then in 1981, MGM purchased United Artists, making MGM owners of half the James Bond franchise. And it was Cubby Broccoli and MGM that made the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films as well as the Daniel Craig Bond films. And then in May 2021, just a few years ago, Amazon bought MGM, making them the owners of half the James Bond franchise, with the Broccoli family owning the other half. And that's why they're having problems now making the 26th James Bond movie. Because the Broccoli family, who owns half of Bond, wants to create a more serious James Bond film in line with the legacy of the previous movies, where they only produce one movie every few years. However, Amazon, who owns the other half, want the James Bond franchise to be more youthful and hip and appeal to a new demographic. And Amazon also thought of the James Bond franchise as content and wanted to create more content for Amazon Prime. And one of the ideas they kept pitching was a Miss Moneypenny streaming series, as well as a Bond miniseries starring a possible African-American female James Bond. Now, on the other hand, the Broccoli family did not want to dilute the brand and just wanted to focus on making one really good James Bond movie. So for over a year, the Broccoli family and Amazon were at a stalemate. However, in February 2025, the stalemate resolved when Amazon offered the Broccoli family $1 billion for the creative rights to the 007 franchise. And contrary to some belief, the Broccoli family will still own 50% of the franchise forever. And so they'll get to keep 50% of any profits from the James Bond movie. They only gave up creative control. So that means from here on out, whatever James Bond property we see on the big screen or on streaming will be produced 100% by Amazon. And after seeing The Lord of the Rings Rings of Power, I really don't know what to think about that. The 1973's Live and Let Die was heavily borrowing from the success of the black exploitation films like Shaft and Superfly. Later, Moonraker will take inspiration from the success of Star Wars. And it's clear here that the 1974 Man with the Golden Gun is trying to borrow from the success of the Hong Kong martial arts films that were popular at the time. Only 2 years earlier, Bruce Lee had released The Fist of Fury in the US, and just a year earlier, Enter the Dragon was released, and those films were both an international phenomenon, sparking the martial arts craze of the 1970s, a craze that we can argue has never really died to this day. Unfortunately, it's apparent here that Guy Hamilton was not much of a martial artist, and it appears that no one on set really knew any real martial arts because the martial arts in this movie is pretty terrible. And maybe you could get away with that in the mid-1970s because martial arts was a fairly new thing, but now we watch it today in the post-Matrix, post-John Wick age where the Hong Kong style action has fully penetrated Hollywood, and the martial arts is just terrible. And it's odd because there appears to be at least 100 Asians on set, and it's odd that they really couldn't find one martial artist. Because aside from a few scenes, there's that exciting sword fight scene, and maybe a few martial arts scenes, it's very embarrassing from a martial arts choreography point of view. And then we get this laughable scene where 2 teenage girls takes down an entire organization of trained assassins. And the scene is just ridiculous and really takes the film franchise to a new low. Well, after screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz finished the first draft of the screenplay, he knew that he didn't have a very good script, and he turned it in and apologized to Cubby Broccoli and Guy Hamilton and admitted that he was fresh out of ideas for the movie. Therefore, Cubby Broccoli brought back Richard Maibaum, who had written 6 previous James Bond movies, and he took another pass at the script. And it was Richard Maibaum who added the B story about the Solex agitator. And that's another thing that this film borrows is from the energy crisis, which was in the headlines from 1973 to 1974. The 1973 oil crisis caused oil shortages all across the world where people were standing in lines at gas stations. This was a time in our history when OPEC, aka the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and at that time was Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Ecuador, these nations decided to start an oil embargo against the United States for the American involvement in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And the embargo was very effective, and it demonstrated Saudi Arabia's diplomatic and economic power. Crude oil prices, which had originally been $3 a barrel, for years suddenly jumped up to $10 a barrel, and at times went as high as $12 a barrel. And Americans began to see the effects of that in their gas prices. Because ever since the 1940s, gas in the US cost about 30 cents a gallon. And it remained that way to the 50s and the 1960s and even to the 1970s until 1973 when gas prices slowly began to climb up so that by 1979, gas was $1 a gallon. And that's where it stayed from 1979 to the 2000s. Eon went location scouting for the film, and the first location they considered was Jamaica. And this would have been a significant cost-cutting location. However, since much of the last film, Live and Let Die, was filmed in Jamaica, Eon opted for an international, exotic locale. And originally, they considered Iran. However, they couldn't find any good locations, and so that idea was nixed. The next location they considered was Beirut, since much of the novel takes place in Beirut. However, again, they could not find any suitable locations to film, and therefore only a small portion of the beginning of the movie takes place in Beirut. Guy Hamilton was a huge fan of Vietnam, but considering the Vietnam War, filming there was out of the question. However, next to Vietnam was Thailand, and this country was perfect. Because in 1974, Thailand was not quite the tourist destination that it was today, and Broccoli and Hamilton fell in love with a small island near Phuket Island, which was at that time very deserted. And so it was decided. The 2 locations for the film would be Thailand and Hong Kong. And this is the second Roger Moore James Bond movie, and he is quite good here as Bond. He continues to play Bond as this paradox of this classy, sophisticated gentleman, while on the other side, this slightly devilish, sadistic assassin. And Moore plays him with just enough of a twinkle and a smile to make him likable and sympathetic, even when he's killing people or committing despicable acts. Because there's something just classy and likable about the way Moore plays 007. For the role of the main antagonist, Francisco Scaramanga, Tom Mankiewicz was inspired by the final action sequence in Shane, where Shane battles the villain Jack Wilson, played by Jack Palance. Therefore, the producers wanted to hire Jack Palance for the role of Scaramanga. However, Jack Palance was not interested and turned it down. The producers then considered Christopher Lee, who was best known for his recurring role as Count Dracula. And when he received the script for The Man with the Golden Gun, he was very excited and accepted right away. And Christopher Lee is brilliant as Francisco Scaramanga. He is Bond's opposite number in this movie, and when you meet him, you fear for our 007. His performance adds gravitas that is missing for the rest of the film. And Christopher Lee is actually Ian Fleming's cousin, and Fleming wanted him to play James Bond when the first Bond movie was being made. Christopher Lee and Ian Fleming loved to golf together, and Lee remembers Ian Fleming asking him to audition for the role of Bond. Interestingly enough, in this movie, Scaramanga has a third nipple, which in reality is an actual biological occurrence that's known as polythelia or polymastia. And if you're Chandler Bing from Friends, it's known as a nubbin. Sir Christopher Lee was born on May 27, 1922 in London, and his parents were separated when he was 4 and divorced shortly. His mother then married Harcourt George St. Croix Rose, who was the uncle of Ian Fleming, and thus he and Ian Fleming became cousins. During World War II, Christopher Lee volunteered for the Royal Air Force and then joined Royal Air Force Intelligence. And after the end of World War II in 1946, his cousin Niccolo Carandini, who was the Italian ambassador to Britain, suggested that Christopher Lee become an actor. Initially, he struggled finding roles, and in 1948, he got his first role in a Terence Young movie called Corridor of Mirrors. And after 6 years of struggling as an actor, his first big break came in 1952 when Douglas Fairbanks Jr. began making films and cast Christopher Lee as one of his regular character actors in 16 of his movies. And this gave him regular acting work. Then in 1957, he was cast as Frankenstein for Hammer Productions, and this would be a very fruitful relationship. He then starred as Count Dracula in the 1958 film Dracula, which was a huge hit and was considered one of the best British films. And Christopher Lee became an instant superstar, and he would go on to play Dracula 10 times, 7 more times in Hammer films and 3 more times for films and other productions. And during this time, he also starred in The Hounds of Baskervilles and then played Sherlock Holmes in the 1962 Sherlock Holmes and the Deadly Necklace. And then in 1974, he starred as Scaramanga in this movie. And this role helped him break into Hollywood films, where he consistently continued to act into his 90s and passed away in 2015 at the age of 93. And today he is probably best known for his role as Saruman in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as Count Dooku in the Star Wars prequels. Hervé Villechaize is interesting as the henchman Knick-Knack, and director Guy Hamilton wanted him to be a miniature version of Oddjob with his bowler hat and his suit. And as an intentional homage to that character, who was a henchman in Goldfinger, which was directed by Guy Hamilton. And Knick-Knack's role here is also similar to the Pink Panther character Kato, a loyal companion who is constantly trying to kill Inspector Clouseau to help him keep his skills sharp. And likewise, Knick-Knack would hire mob assassins to try to kill Scaramanga and lure them into his funhouse to give Scaramanga some exercise. So Hervé Villechaize is an intriguing actor, and his charisma shines on screen, and we can see the groundwork for why he'll become one of television's most iconic characters, Tattoo on Fantasy Island. And apparently, Hervé Villechaize had an appetite for women and really enjoyed himself in Thailand. He spent every night hanging out at the Thailand strip clubs and at the brothels, and people say that he frequently came on set hungover with no sleep, having had all night of partying. But his cast members state that he was the sweetest gentleman and was absolutely charming and kind to all of his castmates, and they all fell in love with him. And he apparently had a very friendly crush on Maud Adams, and the two would give each other small gifts every day, and she absolutely adored him. One star who did not appreciate Hervé Villechaize was Roger Moore, who simply found him a deviant and a very creepy man, and admitted that he struggled to warm up to him. Hervé Villechaize was born on April 23, 1943 in Paris, France, and was born with dwarfism and stood at 3 foot 11 inches. His father was a surgeon and his mother was a wealthy European socialite. Villechaize was initially a painter and photographer, and at the age of 16 he studied art, and in 1961 he became the youngest artist to have his work displayed in the Museum of Paris. And at age 21 he moved to the United States and began to act in off-Broadway plays. And he got small roles in various movies, but was so poor that he was living out of his car in Los Angeles when his big break came by being cast in this film. And after this movie in 1977, he was cast as Tattoo, Mr. Rourke's assistant on Fantasy Island. Sadly, in 1993, at the age of 50, Hervé, who suffered from depression and alcoholism, as well as chronic pain, tragically took his life. The character of Knick-Knack was originally named Demi-Tasse, which is half cup in French. Maud Adams starred in this movie as Andrea Anders, who was Scaramanga's girlfriend, and she's the one who sends Bond the bullet, which eventually triggers this movie. And in reality, it turns out that she is betraying Scaramanga in hopes that James Bond will kill him, thus freeing her. Maud Adams was born on February 12, 1945 in Luleå, Sweden, and she wanted to become an interpreter, but at the age of 18, a photographer asked to take her picture and then submitted it to the Miss Sweden contest, and this launched her successful modeling career. At the age of 25, she was asked to appear in the 1970 film The Boys in the Band, which led to guest spots on Hawaii Five-0 and Kojak, and then she starred in this movie, which catapulted her to international fame. Maud Adams will go on to star in another James Bond film as the main femme fatale in the movie Octopussy. And interestingly, a lot of people don't know that Maud Adams had a brief 3-second uncredited cameo in A View to a Kill. Maud Adams was friends with Octopussy director John Glenn and was visiting the set of View to a Kill, and John Glenn put her in the background just for fun as an Easter egg for die-hard fans. If you blink, you'll miss it. So she therefore remains the only Bond girl to be in 3 Bond movies as 3 different characters. And if you see her, she's walking in the background when Bond is talking to Agent David Yip, who's played by Asian actor Chuck Lee. And now we have to talk about another weak element in this movie, which is the Bond girl, Mary Goodnight, played by Britt Eklund, who actually lobbied very hard for this role. Britt Eklund had been a fan of the James Bond franchise since she first saw Dr. No, and she was dazzled by the scene where Ursula Andress emerges out of the water, and she dreamed of one day being a Bond girl. Britt Eklund telephoned Cubby Broccoli and asked if she could be considered for the role of Mary Goodnight. Cubby Broccoli was interested in hiring Britt Eklund as Mary Goodnight and had just cast Maud Adams as Scaramanga's doomed lover, Andrea. However, when it was officially announced that Maud Adams was officially cast, Britt Eklund misunderstood and thought Maud Adams was cast as Mary Goodnight, and she was devastated and admitted that she cursed Maud Adams. She was then relieved to get the call that she was being strongly considered for Mary Goodnight. Britt Eklund was born on October 6, 1942 in Stockholm, Sweden, and as a teenager, she was spotted by a talent agent who sent her to London and set her up for auditions where she initially had small roles in various Swedish films. Now, prior to her role in this James Bond movie, Britt Eklund has a connection to another infamous James Bond film. Eklund was once married to Peter Sellers, who played James Bond, aka Evelyn Tremble, in the non-canon 1967 Casino Royale. And one of the reasons why that movie was such a train wreck was that Peter Sellers, who was originally the star of the film and was paid $1 million for the role, would disappear for days at a time, thus holding up production. And the main reason why he would disappear was that his wife, Britt Eklund, was divorcing him, and Peter Sellers was busy trying to prevent her from leaving him. In 1964, Peter Sellers was 38 years old when he met Britt Eklund, who was only 21 years old at the time, and they married 10 days after meeting. And they would soon divorce in 1968, shortly after the release of Casino Royale. And that's a fascinating story, so please check out my video on the 1967 Casino Royale movie. Well, she married Peter Sellers, who was extremely jealous and paranoid that she would cheat on him, and he would quiz her nightly on what scenes she had, and Sellers would even call her co-stars and ask them to keep their eyes on her. And then he began to sabotage her acting roles. So in 1967, she became fed up with him and tried to divorce him, but he continued to beg her not to leave him. Well, they finally did divorce in 1968. This movie starts with Scaramanga and his girlfriend resting on his private island and served by his butler, Knick Knack. And Knick Knack secretly hires an American gangster to assassinate his boss. And the gangster is named Rodney and is played by legendary character actor Mark Lawrence. And this is likely the same gangster from Diamonds Are Forever, the one who threw Plenty O'Toole out of the window. And while that character is not named, he was also played by Mark Lawrence and played exactly like the same character here, and they even have the same hat. Knick Knack pays Rodney to try to kill Scaramanga, but he's too good and Rodney bites the dust. And this appears to be something Scaramanga does every day in order to keep his stills fresh. We see that Scaramanga has a wax mannequin of James Bond and has his eyes set on challenging him. Of course, this will be a setup to the ending of the movie where this mannequin is going to become very important. And it is interesting that we have 2 Roger Moore James Bond films, and both of the introductions do not feature James Bond. We then jump to the musical number with a song by Scottish singer Lulu, and the song is catchy, but it's a little too on the nose. And today it is considered one of the worst James Bond theme songs. We then get Roger Moore who checks into M's office, and here we get a Roger Moore James Bond trope where M asks Bond what he knows about some random topic, in this case what he knows about the man with a golden gun, and Bond just happens to know everything about that topic.
What do you know about a man called Scaramanga, 007?
Scaramanga? The man with the golden gun?
Born in a circus, father the ringmaster, possibly Cuban, mother English, a snake charmer.
And we learn that Scaramanga has sent a golden bullet with 007 written on it, indicating that Bond is his next target. So M pulls James Bond off his assignment and has him find Scaramanga before Scaramanga can find him. And this is the premise of the movie: Britain's greatest secret agent versus the world's deadliest assassin. When they were creating the promo shot for this movie, the filmmakers loved the fact that Christopher Lee was substantially taller than Roger Moore, which gave James Bond the feeling of being the underdog in the rivalry. Another brilliant element in this movie is the actual golden gun, which supposedly fires a 23-karat golden bullet, and is probably the most memorable iconic prop in the film. And this is pure James Bond fantasy, and I love it. Scaramanga assembles this gun from a golden fountain pen, a cigarette lighter, and a cigarette case, and uses a cufflink as a trigger. Also, Scaramanga holds the actual golden bullet he's going to use to kill his target in his belt buckle. And apparently Christopher Lee struggled while assembling the golden gun and found its construction quite challenging. Apparently there were 3 models of this gun made, and each of them was valued at about $100,000. However, in 2008, it was noticed that one of the golden guns had been stolen from the prop room at MGM. James Bond goes to Beirut and finds the girlfriend of 002, who is a belly dancer who wears the golden bullet as a navel jewel. And it is here we get the infamous goof of the movie, where during the action scene, the camera pans across a room and we actually see the cameraman in the shot of the mirror. Oops. Bond takes the bullet and takes Q to analyze it, and Q discovers that a gunmaker named Lazar, who lives in Macau, makes the bullet for Scaramanga. And Bond threatens Lazar and learns that his mistress picks up the bullets at a casino, and Bond follows her. And here we meet Bond's contact, Mary Goodnight. James Bond tracks Scaramanga's mistress to her hotel room and, shockingly enough, slaps her around. And this is where we get the difference between Roger Moore's Bond and Sean Connery's Bond. Because when we see Sean Connery do this, we didn't bat an eye. He just had that demeanor of someone who would do that. But when Roger Moore does it, it just seems out of place. And this is because the writers of James Bond, Richard Maibaum and Tom Mankiewicz, were still writing James Bond for Sean Connery, and it's in these moments that it really shows. It wouldn't be until The Spy Who Loved Me that the writers really got a sense of Roger Moore and would write the entire James Bond screenplay to match Roger Moore's sensibilities. Bond forces Andrea to tell him where Scaramanga is, and she reveals that he's at the Bottoms Up Club. And when he goes there, we see that Scaramanga has a drop on him, but rather than shoot him, he shoots another man. And this man is Kitson, who is a researcher of an energy device and is in possession of the Solex agitator, which will be the MacGuffin of this movie. Scaramanga kills Kitson, and Knick-Knack takes the Solex agitator. So what is this Solex agitator? Well, it is a pure MacGuffin in the Hitchcockian sense, because it really is nothing more than a plot device. And it's not a very well thought out plot device. It was simply created for this movie, and supposedly it can harness solar energy and can potentially solve the global energy crisis, and that's about as far as anybody thought about it. However, as a movie prop, apparently the Solex agitator is quite popular among collectors. Fans have made replicas, and Factory Entertainment made a replica that retails for around $200. And in 2012, one of the actual props of the Solex agitator used in this movie was sold at Christie's auction for $85,000. James Bond is arrested by Lieutenant Hip, who takes Bond to a sunken ship where it turns out is a secret MI6 base. And this set is a really inventive set piece, where you can see that it is a sunken ship with all the sets being at a diagonal. Bond speculates that since Scaramanga was paid $1 million to assassinate him, they need to identify all the wealthy people in the world who is rich enough to hire Scaramanga. And this leads them to a wealthy businessman in Thailand named Hai Fat. And Bond poses as Scaramanga to meet Hai Fat using a false third nipple, assuming that Scaramanga and Hai Fat have never met. And while it appears that Hai Fat seems to have fallen for it, we then learn that Scaramanga and Hai Fat had met earlier, and this is a trap for James Bond. Now, humorously, in the original concept for the movie, Hai Fat was to have a younger brother who was named Low Fat. But this idea was dropped. And it's from this point in the movie that the movie begins to descend progressively further and further into weirdness. Knick-Knack appears dressed in a bizarre facial makeup, carrying a trident, knocks out James Bond, and he wakes up in a martial arts school. Now remember, this was capitalizing on the martial arts craze of the early 70s, and we see a few visual homages to the Bruce Lee movies. James Bond is pitted against some students, and he cheats and knocks one of them out during the bow, But the second guy doesn't look like he'll for it, so James Bond jumps through the window. Luckily for Bond, Lieutenant Hip and his two nieces happen to be driving nearby, and in a bit of absurdity, his two teenage nieces turn out to be skilled at martial arts, and they're able to take out an entire martial arts school of adult male assassins? Okay. This is ridiculous, except that it gets some modern redemption because of who's playing one of the nieces. Who is playing one of the nieces is Qiao Yuan. And this was one of her first movie roles, and she was only 24 years old at the time. Well, she'll become one of the most famous Hong Kong action stars in the future, and is probably most famous in the US as the landlady in the 2004 film Kung Fu Hustle. In a bizarre twist, Lieutenant Hip actually picks up his two nieces, but forgets to pick up Bond, leaving him with a martial arts school of assassins. And this leads to the main action piece of the movie, where Bond is being chased through the streets and the rivers of Bangkok. He steals a boat, and in another bizarre moment, a little Thai kid swims on this boat and tries to sell him a souvenir, and Bond pushes him in the water. And it's a cruel scene, and it does stand out, but it is also hilarious. However, years later in 1991, almost 20 years after this movie, Roger Moore was appointed as the UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, specifically bringing attention to the child crisis issues around the world and enlisting support and donations to help children. So every time he sees this scene, it always made him cringe. Roger Moore said publicly that he feels horror about pushing the young Thai kid off the boat. So it's okay, Roger. We forgive you. Sheriff J.W. Pepper enters the scene, and it's so weird to have him here in this movie. And here he is dialed up to 11. So Scaramanga kills Hi-Fat and takes over his organization and the Solex agitator. While Bond is seducing Mary Goodnight, Andrea visits, so he hides her under the blankets, and Andrea reveals that it was she who sent the bullet in hopes that he would kill Scaramanga, thus freeing her from his clutches. And she even agrees to get him the Solex agitator. Bond then hides Mary Goodnight in the closet while he seduces Andrea. And man, you really feel that Mary Goodnight has just flushed her self-respect down the toilet. Did I mention that Britt Eklund really lobbied hard for this role? So Bond meets Andrea at a Thai kickboxing arena in order to obtain the Solex agitator, but she has been killed. And Scaramanga warns Bond not to interfere with his affairs. But Bond spots the Solex agitator on the floor and picks it up and gives it to Mary Goodnight, who gets thrown into Scaramanga's car with the Solex agitator. Bond steals an AMC, and what are the odds that he steals a car that Sheriff J. Pepper is looking at? So what? Why would Sheriff Pepper be looking at buying an AMC while vacationing in Thailand? But let's face it, it's not the weirdest thing about this movie. So Bond, with Sheriff Pepper in the passenger seat, are in hot pursuit of Scaramanga and Knick-Knack, who have just kidnapped Mary Goodnight. And one of the highlights of this film is a stunning practical stunt, which in reality was one of the most dangerous stunts performed on screen at the time. James Bond drives an AMC Hornet over a bridge and does a 360-degree longitudinal aerial twist in mid-air and lands on the other side of the river. And this was not a special effect. They actually did the stunt. And what got him the idea is that producer Cubby Broccoli saw this stunt being done by a famous driver named Jay Milligan, who used to perform a smaller and shorter version of the stunt called the Astro Spiral Drop. And he did it live in this car show called the American Motor Corporation American Thrill Show. And the stunt driver, Jay Milligan himself, would drive an AMG Hornet in this stunt. Cubby Broccoli contacted him, and therefore Jay Milligan advised the crew on how to do this. And in fact, Cubby Broccoli actually paid for the rights to the stunt to prevent it from being used in any other movie, and to verify that it had not been used in any other movie previously. They were very serious about this stunt. And the stunt used in this movie was much larger and longer than the stunt done for the car show. And it was done from one bank to another crossing the river, and it would set the world's record for such a jump. So the American Motor Corporation, who makes the AMC Hornet, donated 15 AMC vehicles, as well as paid a lot of product placement money in exchange for the cars and the 1974 AMC Hornet that was actually used in the stunt. A British stuntman named Bumps Willard actually performed the stunt, and they were very concerned for his safety, that multiple ambulances, cranes, water divers were all on standby just outside the frame just in case something bad happened. And this is cool, the stunt was pre-planned using computer simulations by researchers at Cornell University who had actually previously been working on rollover collision study for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So they already had the data in the manual, and they created a computer model to assess the possibility and safety of this corkscrew barrel roll jump. And everyone held their breath while this jump was being done, so the asteroid spiral jump went off without a hitch, and stuntman Bumps Willard was given this huge unknown sum of money for successfully filming it. And this apparently goes down in history as the first big stunt that was planned on a computer. Now this stunt possibly could have been mesmerizing on screen, but unfortunately, I myself as well as many fans feel that this stunt is completely ruined by this comedic slide whistle that was added in later. And if you've seen this, you know what I'm talking about. This slide whistle sound effect boggles the mind why they added this, and it does ruin a potentially awesome scene. What happened was that legendary composer John Barry, who came up with the James Bond theme song, apparently argued with Albert Broccoli over whether it should be left in or not. And we don't know who wanted it in and who wanted it out, but it is assumed that John Barry actually wanted it in because years later, John Barry has gone on to say that he regretted putting that sound effect in. And many critics cite the slide whistle as a sort of a metaphor for a larger concept of what's really wrong with a film, a potentially good movie that is undermined by cheap comedy. Now there are some other weird elements. First of all, I think it's kind of weird that the car itself is an AMC. The AMC were makers of these weird automobiles in the 1970s like the Pacer and the Gremlin. And you've seen them. These are very odd looking cars, and once you've seen them, you just can't forget them. And this is when product placement begins to undermine the movie. Because Scaramanga, the world's greatest assassin who gets paid $1 million per hit, who owns his own island and can drive any car he wants, he should have driven a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, and that would have given him some panache as well as some menace. But in this movie, he drives an AMC Malador hatchback, which just makes him look like a goofball. Although the hatchback is apparently a flying hatchback with wings, it's still not believable. And apparently that stunt where the car turns into an airplane was done by using a miniature remote control model. But imagine if that car was a Ferrari or a Lamborghini that transformed into an airplane. That would have been so much more awesome. So James Bond tracks Mary Goodnight through her tracker to Scaramanga's island, and this is an amazing location, with these rocks seem to grow out of the water. And back when this was filmed, it was a hidden location in Thailand that was basically deserted. Well, the people of this island are going to capitalize on its association with the James Bond movie and call it James Bond Island, and it will immediately become a popular tourist spot. And to this day, James Bond Island is a very popular tourist destination. Scaramanga welcomes Bond, and he even gives Bond a tour of the facility. And just like any of the best Bond villains, he's going to invite Bond to a nice, luxurious meal just before they begin to kill each other like civilized people. So the conceit is that Scaramanga has only one golden bullet to kill his enemy. And there's a deleted scene where Bond would construct a Molotov cocktail and throw it at Scaramanga, but he would use his bullet up by shooting the cocktail in the air. However, Scaramanga would have a second bullet. And this would demonstrate both Scaramanga's amazing gun shooting skills, but also show that he cheats. And in a clever bit of foreshadowing, remember Chekhov's wax statue? Bond replaces himself with a wax dummy, which allows for him to get the drop on Scaramanga, thus winning the duel. Mary Goodnight accidentally triggers the destruction of the island, but Bond is able to get the Solex agitator in time and the two escape. And apparently while filming this scene, Britt Ekland actually slipped and fell and really hurt herself and couldn't move. However, the set was rigged to explode, and both Roger Moore and Britt Ekland needed to get out of there, or they both could have gotten really injured. So Roger Moore actually went back and basically dragged Britt Ekland to safety. And the movie ends with Nick Nack attacking Bond and Goodnight, but 007 is able to catch him in a suitcase and tie him to the mast of the boat. When this film came out, the audience reaction was mixed, and it was a moderate box office success. It was made for a low budget of $7 million and initially made $21 million in the US, and would later go on to make a total of $98 million worldwide, so it was a very profitable film. However, it clearly fell short of its immediate predecessor, which had made $161 million. So while it did make money, it was considered a major letdown. In fact, only Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service had made less money. But when you adjust these movies for inflation, The Man with the Golden Gun remained the absolute lowest grossing movie up to that point. And to this day, Man with the Golden Gun remains the second lowest grossing Bond film of all time. When adjusted for inflation, only License to Kill made less money. And critically, it did not do well, and most critics panned it at the time. And it really hasn't fared much better with time, because it currently holds a 43% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it is universally on every James Bond list as one of the top 5 worst Bond films. And Entertainment Weekly, this is the 4th worst Bond film out of all 23 Bond films. And IGN rated this movie as the absolute worst Bond film, number 23 out of 23. And so it was concluded by audiences, by movie critics, and even by James Bond fans that the James Bond franchise might be tapped out. Everyone thought that the James Bond character had completely run its course and that the movie franchise had nowhere else to go. And it was assumed that nothing could really save it nor revive it. So, was Roger Moore's career as Bond in danger? Possibly. However, there were factors that helped Roger Moore. First, Harry Saltzman was out, and he had just sold his shares to United Artists, and Cubby Broccoli was the only producer at Eon. And Albert Broccoli liked Roger Moore, and he was motivated to give Moore one more chance at Bond, because he really believed in Roger Moore. In later interviews and documentaries, Roger Moore always thanked Albert Broccoli for his support after The Man with the Golden Gun in helping him keep his job. And it seems to imply that perhaps United Artists were not happy with Roger Moore after The Man with the Golden Gun and may have been wanting a switch. But Cubby Broccoli pushed back any United Artists resistance and fully supported Moore. Well, good thing that Broccoli stayed strong and had the integrity that once again is going to prove to be right. Because at the moment of its demise, when the franchise seemed to be knocked down and down for the count, the next movie is going to prove that there was a lot more gas in James Bond's tank. The next film, The Spy Who Loved Me, would be one of the best James Bond films ever, holding its own against any of the Sean Connery films. And this would eventually pave the way for incredible movies like For Your Eyes Only and Octopussy, and revive the entire James Bond franchise to a whole new level. And it would completely cement Roger Moore as 007 for the new generation. Great acting by Roger Moore, Christopher Lee, and Hervé Villechaize, plus some iconic elements, could not save this movie from the cheap jokes and overall silliness. It is both mindless fun, but it's also painful at times to try to watch, creating a very inconsistent experience. Well, that ends my video on The Man with the Golden Gun. If you like this movie, please check out my other videos on the James Bond movies, Star Trek, Rocky, as well as the Airplane franchise. So that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.